Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program reporting on the new Student Loan Report, which is a collaboration between the ABA Young Lawyers Division and the AccessLex Institute. As many of you may know, in 2020, our groups partnered for a groundbreaking survey and to report the depth of not only the amount of student debt held by young lawyers, but also the impacts of that debt. With few exceptions, we saw that all law school graduates are impacted by student loan debt. And for many, that debt continues to grow after graduation, impacting personal lives, career paths, and even mental health. Our groups again collaborated for a new study to further examine the toll of student debt. And the timing of this survey also implicated elements of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So welcome all as we share what we found. I'd like to introduce our presenters today. My name is Aaron Sohaski, and I work as the Director of Contracting and Compliance at Henry Ford Health System. And this year, I have the pleasure to serve as the ABA Young Lawyers Division's Director of Student Debt and Financial Wellness. Joining me today, we'll also hear from Chris Jennison, a federal government attorney who serves as this year's special advisor to the ABA YLD's Student Debt and Financial Wellness team. And finally, we'll also hear from Tiffany Cochran, who is the Managing Director with Research and Strategic Implementation for the AccessLex Institute. With introductions out of the way, I'll turn it over to Tiffany. Tiffany, take it away.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you all so much for joining us for today's Facebook Live event to dive into these survey results. I want to start by giving you a little bit of background on the survey. So as Aaron mentioned, our respective organizations collaborated last year on the first student debt report from the Young Lawyers Division. And that report really laid the groundwork for the results that we are sharing with you this year. One of the most salient findings for me, and I think many of us who worked on this project last year, was that we found that debt isn't only impacting these big life milestone decisions that young lawyers are making, but it's also impacting their everyday lives. And so we wanted to make sure that this year's survey captured more of those observations distinctly and that we were more intentional about gathering that information to inform our efforts. And so we explored a number of new topics on that front, and I'll share a little bit more about those with you later in the program. We also, again, want to acknowledge, as Aaron shared earlier, that we can't discount the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Last year's 2020 report and the survey that informed that report was released just before the onset of the pandemic. So we were able to capture respondents before the pandemic became what we know it as today. And so just as I'm sure many of you can attest to the fact that our lives have really been changed by this pandemic over the last 18 months, the same is true for those who responded to this survey. And so even though the COVID-19 pandemic was not an explicit focus of our study, it more than likely impacted some of the results that we are sharing with you. I also want to talk a little bit about those who comprise the survey that we're talking about today. So the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division distributed this survey to its membership database via email blast and social media. And so that yielded 1,347 responses, which we were very excited about, and that was higher than what we gained from the last year's project. However, I think it's very important to keep in mind that the sample is not representative. The membership database for the American Bar Association's Young Lawyers Division is 10,000 records or tens of thousand records deep. And so unfortunately, when we think about our over 1,300 responses in comparison to the database, that is only a fraction of the full membership. And so we can't necessarily generalize these results to the membership population, nor can we say that they're representative of all young lawyers and recent law graduates. But we were very excited as we examined the demographics of the respondents that we received, that they really do represent a diverse cross-section of recent law graduates and young lawyers, as well as a number of different areas of practice, and including some who are not practicing law at all. And so it's very important to keep in mind that even though it's not representative, we're still very excited about these results. And we're sort of peeling back the layers of an issue that affects young lawyers that really has been understudied in most part. And so these are still no less informative findings that we're sharing with you today. And one more thing that I want to share is that even though we do have a very diverse sample that we're sharing with these results from, that the majority of these respondents did borrow to finance some portion of their higher education, whether it was for law school or a prior degree. And so when we talk about these results, we're really talking about those who borrowed for their higher education and less so about those who did not. So in terms of what we gathered, as I mentioned, we wanted to revisit some topics from last year's survey while also exploring new topic areas. And so on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm sharing with you some of those high-level areas that we explored last year that we explored again this year. So education debt balances. One thing I should say that we did differently this year was we actually asked about bar exam loan debt. So we were very curious to understand what percentage of those who responded to the survey borrowed to cover their bar exam finances, including their living expenses during the bar prep period. And so that was a really helpful addition. And then of course, we revisited demographics of the sample, in addition to how their education debt is impacting their ability to achieve certain life milestones. On the right side of the screen, these are where we explored new topics, including things like how debt is impacting well-being and overall financial stability among young lawyers, as well as the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Both the American Bar Association and AccessLex Institute are huge proponents of the PSLF program, and so we wanted to understand more about that from this survey. And finally, we were interested in understanding more about reflections on JD attainment and pre-law knowledge. And particularly, we wanted to understand how today's young lawyer is thinking about their JD, the value of their law degree, as well as to the extent to which they felt that they were adequately prepared and understood the weight of the debt that they were taking and how that debt would impact their personal and professional lives after graduation. I also want to clarify that when we're talking about today's young lawyer, we're talking about the demographics of those that comprise the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division membership. And those are young lawyers who are aged 36 or younger, as well as those who graduated law school within the last 10 years. So with all that context out of the way, I want to dive into the survey results themselves, starting with a brief discussion of debt load for today's young lawyer. As Erin mentioned, we were informed in last year's survey that a number of recent law graduates report that they have not been able to pay down their debt balances after graduation. This year, we found that 42% of those who responded to the survey reported that their debt balances today are no lower than they were at graduation. And so when we break down that 42%, we find that 27% actually reported that their debt balances have actually increased since they graduated. The remaining 15% report that their debt balances are the same. It's also important to point out that throughout the report, but less so in this presentation, we are disaggregating a number of different data points to help you understand that the debt picture looks very different depending on the types of law graduates that you're talking about. And so in this case, we've disaggregated this debt balance picture by race ethnicity to share with you that one of the findings from our analysis was that 44% of Black graduates who responded to the survey reported having a higher debt balance now compared to at graduation than the 27% overall. And so as we're unpacking these results together, it's important to consider ways that we can disaggregate this information and also think forward to taking actions and recommending solutions that are targeting these interventions appropriately to ensure that those who need these services and supports are aware of them and are the ones that stand to benefit and that are actually benefiting from these interventions that we're actually trying to implement. One other thing that we wanted to do a little bit differently this year was understand why these balances are increasing. So we added a survey question that essentially allowed graduates to explain to us how do they perceive, what reasons do they share for why these balances have increased. And so we find that 55% of respondents whose debt balances increased shared that it was because they are currently enrolled in an income-based repayment program where their payments are not sufficient to cover the principal. And so as a result, their monthly payments are largely going toward interest and not allowing them to pay down their debt balances. So now that we kind of have an understanding of the debt load picture for today's young lawyer, I want to pivot and talk about how the debt load is impacting their career and job choices. So we found that 80% of respondents reported that their debt balance has impacted their career or job choice in some way. So for over half of them, they reported that they weighed salary more importantly in their job selection than they would have if it wasn't for their debt balance. We also found that a third reported that they took a job that was less focused on public service or doing good than they intended. And so what this suggests to me as I look to try to understand these results is that in some ways, debt could be encouraging young lawyers to deviate from the very professional and career goals that they aspire to that may have even led them to a law degree. And so it's really important to understand what that might mean for the way that they value their JD credential, as well as how they're experiencing life as a young professional post-graduation. I also think this is a good time to pivot over and talk a little bit more about what we found on the public service loan forgiveness front. And so I'm going to turn it over to Chris to share with you a little bit about those findings.
Thanks, Tiffany. It's important, while you just hit that 1/3 of respondents took a job that was less focused on public service loan forgiveness or on public service in general, we are still seeing from the data here that there is significant agreement and support for public service loan forgiveness as well. So of our responses, nearly 1/5, 19% said that they are pursuing public service loan forgiveness. 70% agreed that it allowed them to work in their chosen profession, which is very reassuring for the intents of the program. And 73% intend to continue working in public service loan forgiveness or in public service after their forgiveness term has actually lapsed. So with this data, it's important for us to follow these trends as well in coming years. As you may well know, public service loan forgiveness was only developed in the 2007 timeframe. And so given the 10 years or 120 on-time qualifying payments you have to make to qualify for public service loan forgiveness, the first individuals who were eligible did not come around until 2017. So we're still early on in the pool of candidates who could theoretically be able to achieve public service loan forgiveness. And you may have seen recent reporting elsewhere in the Washington Post that showed that there are about 1.3 million people pursuing public service loan forgiveness, not talking just about legal careers, but public service loan forgiveness generally. But only about 1 in 5 of those borrowers are on track to secure forgiveness relief by 2026. So it's going to be important for us to continue to watch the trends in the legal profession in coming years, as more and more of those who may have entered law school and entered their legal professions in public service orientations, to see how many of them are able to actually achieve the promise of public service loan forgiveness. And with that, I think we're going to see for a moment if we have any questions.
Well, Chris, I can certainly kick it off. And just to remind the attendees, there is an opportunity to write in any questions that you may have throughout this presentation in the Facebook live chat. And I, serving as a moderator, will make sure that Tiffany and Chris can address them throughout the presentation. But Chris, given the information that you just presented there, the data point really kind of suggests that some individuals took a less public-oriented job than when they entered law school. So meaning, some were altruistic and thought that they would end up in a public sector, but because of just the way life worked, they ended up in the private sector for a myriad of reasons. So how can we temper that, and how do we square that with the promise of public service loan forgiveness? Is there a nexus there that can be made?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I'll say first off, it's above my pay grade and it's above our pay grade. I hope that we are able to get some eyes on this data in the policymaking and legislative space, because public service loan forgiveness is incredibly important for inspiring and engendering a generation of those who are involved in public service, despite the enormous costs to attain higher education. What I think you can see is, yes, 1/3 of our respondents took a job less focused on public service. But when you look at that 70% and 73% that either agree that public service loan forgiveness is allowing them to stay in their allowing them to stay in their career, and the 73% who wish to remain in that public service after they've achieved loan forgiveness, is those who have been able to go into public service are even further entrenched in public service and the good that that entails as well. So where does that leave us? We'll talk a little bit later about some recommendations, including in the public service loan forgiveness space. But I think one thing to consider as we're talking about trying to square the 1/3 less taking a public service job with the high number of people who are in public service loan forgiveness, supporting the program and hoping to stay involved in public service, is maybe there's a need to alter the promise of public service loan forgiveness as well, to either have a lesser step that qualifies for some partial forgiveness or something of that nature too, so that perhaps if you have a life consequence that is coming your way that has to steer you outside of public service, you aren't nonetheless, you don't, as a result of that change in your trajectory, not able to achieve any of the loan forgiveness that you want to get and that you were promised in public service as well. Tiffany, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to something you shared earlier, Chris, when you were presenting these results, that we are just now seeing those who were eligible for PSLF or eligible for loan forgiveness because of public service graduating and sort of applying for the forgiveness that they initially set out on in 2007 and beyond. And as we know, the numbers so far on who's received forgiveness through the program have been very discouraging. And so I know the ABA and certainly AccessLex Institute has been monitoring that and trying to understand the reasons for that. And it seems that it's largely based on sort of the administration of the program, as well as what graduates expected and whether or not they actually met the requirements to be able to receive the forgiveness in 10 years. And so I think some of those suggestions that you made now and that you'll make later about how to improve the program could hopefully encourage more people to take advantage of public service loan forgiveness, because I could imagine among some of our more recent graduates who were represented in this survey who have potentially seen those numbers and are concerned about the program even being there in 10 years, maybe they don't necessarily want to bank their future on it right now. And so I think to the extent that we can alleviate those fears and help make it more transparent why people are not receiving the forgiveness that they expected to, that might hopefully encourage more of those students to actually pursue the program and public service positions. All right, so seeing no additional questions, we're going to move forward with the presentation, but we again encourage you all to drop those questions in the Facebook comments. So now I want to share a little bit with you about what we found when we examined how debt is affecting today's young lawyer in terms of their ability to commit to longer term financial obligations. And so this kind of harkens back to what we talked about in last year's report about how debt is impacting young lawyers' ability to achieve certain life milestones. Again, this year we find that primarily those who are taking on substantial amounts of debt to finance their higher education and their legal education are discouraged from buying a home. And so over half of those who responded to our survey shared that their debt has caused them to postpone or decide not to purchase a house. And you can see that there are other life milestones that are also impacted by this. And so again, we see that some are sharing that they have postponed or decided not to have children as a result of their debt, and so on and so forth. And then here again is another place where it's important to understand that for some graduates and others, these points hit closer to home. And so you can see here that as your debt load increases, or as the debt balance among our respondents increased, so did the percentage of those who reported postponing or foregoing certain life milestones. So in this case, we're showing you the percentages, how the percentages compare across debt balances among those who share that they are postponing or deciding not to buy a house, as well as those who have postponed or decided not to have children. Now, one silver lining of this and of our analysis is that as we look at these responses and as we look at achievement of life milestones by graduation year, we find that those who have been out of law school longer have actually made significant progress in achieving some of these life milestones. And so you can see that those who graduated in 2013 or earlier are much more likely to share that they have children, that they are married, and that they are homeowners compared to those who graduated in more recent years. So this suggests to us that it's more than likely that as we're seeing people share that they're postponing or deciding not to do various things, that they're more likely postponing than outright deciding not to reach for those achievements. We were also really interested to understand not only how debt is impacting achievement of life milestones, but even just decisions around being able to create a more financially stable future. And so we asked a number of different questions, and I'm sharing with you a snippet of those from the report. But one thing that was really clear to us is that it's difficult for young lawyers, particularly those who are taking on significant amounts of debt, to try to save for the future, whether that be for their retirement. For those that have children, a number of them reported that they are not able to save for their children's future. And then we also find that many graduates are struggling to save up for an emergency fund that covers at least 3 months of their living expenses. And again, those percentages increase along with debt balance. So those who have higher amounts of debt are more likely to struggle with these savings goals than other respondents. We also asked a question around how confident the respondents are that they could cover a financial emergency that was $1,000. And just about half of the respondents shared that they were highly confident that they could find the money to cover a $1,000 financial emergency. And just to give you a little bit of context, Bankrate also surveyed 1,000 Americans, and their percentage was 40%. So in some ways, it's encouraging that the young lawyers that we surveyed and that responded to this survey this year are a little bit higher than that. But another way to think about this is if you surveyed pre-law students and asked them, do you expect upon graduating law school to be able to cover a $1,000 financial emergency when you consider how much debt you're taking on, in addition to what income level you expect to be at? I would guess and suspect that many of them would want to be able to say that they could cover a $1,000 emergency, and that more than likely that percentage of expectation would probably be higher than half. And so I think that this is a number that we should definitely think about when we're considering ways that we could provide more financial assistance and education to those who are considering law school, and certainly those that are have already amassed these amounts of debt and are looking for some sort of relief and support in trying to manage that debt. So I want to pause here again to see if there are any questions from our attendees or anything that's come in the Facebook comments since our last pause.
Tiffany, it's striking that last fact there with the 51 to 40%, and the follow-up point that you raised about perceptions of pre-law students, even 1Ls, 2Ls, and where they think they'll fall, right? Like every law student comes out potentially thinking, I'm going to get that big law job, 6-figure salary plus a signing bonus and $1,000 emergency. Yeah, no issue whatsoever, right? We know that perception is not always reality, and for some, fortunately, it can be. But as a survey demonstrates, that's not the case for many. And so, do we have any sense when we're looking at these milestones like home ownership, marriage, having children, how long the delay is lasting? Is it 1 to 5 years, 6 to 10, or beyond that, or in some instances the option is to just forego having children, a house, kids. So do we have a sense of how long that debt is causing a delay?
I don't think so. I think the closest we can get is the slide that I shared earlier, where we're disaggregating that information about who owns a home, who's married, who has children by the year of graduation. I would feel much more confident saying, yes, we can make estimates about that if we had a more robust or representative sample. But what we do see is that it's not 0% for recent graduates, and it's much higher the further out you get from law school. And again, if we're talking about a 10-year time frame, and we're seeing that I think it was over half of those who had graduated further out, who at least are married and who have a home, I think that is relatively an optimistic finding. Again, that you can expect that as you have more years of experience, you can expect that potentially your salary will grow and put you in a better financial position to not only pay down your debt balance, but also to achieve some of the other professional goals that you might have for us, or even personal goals that you have for your life. Any other thoughts or questions? Chris, did you have anything there?
No, I think just quickly, I'd say, unfortunately, this data is not all knowing, right? It'll be interesting to continue to monitor this to see what trends again occur in coming years. And I'm sure that there's some way to extrapolate with the most recent census data how trends have changed over time beyond just our respondents here, the debt loads that have changed generationally over the last few generations. I'm sure have had some impact on delaying those milestones too. But that's a bit more of a conclusion that we can draw from the data that we have here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point that, legal education is not an island unto itself, that certainly the trends that are affecting everybody are also affecting law graduates as well. All right, well, we will move on, seeing no further questions at this time. Okay, so now we want to talk a little bit about how debt is impacting financial well-being for today's young lawyer. And again, this is a bank of questions that we asked on this year's survey that were not in last year's survey. And unsurprisingly, but still unfortunate, is that we find that stress increases with debt balance. So here we're sharing with you where you can see that the percentage of those who had over $200,000 of a remaining education debt balance after graduation were experiencing higher overwhelming stress. 82% were experiencing higher overwhelming stress compared to 62% of those who had $100,000 in debt or less. So debt is definitely causing stress among these graduates. And again, it's more pronounced for those who have higher debt levels. We also wanted to understand a little bit more, again, thinking about the day-to-day experiences that people are having because of their debt and that young lawyers and recent graduates are having because of their debt. So we asked this question about the extent to which they're experiencing anxiety, stress, regret, or guilt due to their student debt in the last month. So we're not talking about since graduation or even over the last year, just in the last month at the time that they took the survey. And you can see that for a majority of those who are represented as borrowers in this sample, that they are experiencing not only feelings of stress and anxiety, but also feelings of regret and guilt around their debt. And I would also say that the percentages are also relatively high for those who report feeling depressed or hopeless, again, on account of their debt, as well as inadequate and embarrassed or ashamed. And so these are real emotions that young lawyers are experiencing that are affecting them. Again, when you consider the time-bound nature of this question about how people have been feeling in the last month, that is pretty striking and something that I would hope that being able to provide some additional resources and support, especially if it's free or low cost, would really help to hopefully alleviate some of these negative emotions that young lawyers associate with their debt load. We were also really curious to understand the level of financial awareness and knowledge that these graduates had while they were still in law school. And so we asked a few questions on this point. The first was just how happy they were with the loan counseling they received while they were law students. And you can see that those percentages, irrespective of debt load, are relatively low. So for those who reported at the time of the survey that they no longer had an education balance, 29%, only 29% of those shared that they were satisfied with the loan counseling they received. And that number was 12% for those who had debt balances of $200,000 or more than $200,000. And so across the board, we're seeing low percentages there. And I think that that's really informative and potentially instructive for ways that law schools can help to mitigate some of the issues that we find in the survey. Unfortunately, we don't understand why so few respondents reported satisfaction with their loan counseling, but I think that could be a really interesting point to explore further in future studies and future surveys. We also found that on the whole, most graduates who borrowed shared that they were aware of the debt that they were borrowing each year. So they had an annual awareness of their debt load. And so it wasn't a surprise to most of them at graduation how much they had assumed to finance their education. But when we looked at the percentages of those who reported that they know how to access free, publicly available financial resources, very few of those, particularly with higher debt loads, reported that they did know this information. And so this, again, is a really important point for thinking about how we target interventions and resources and ensuring that those who need them most are able to access and be aware of that information. So again, I'll stop here and see if there are any questions from the Facebook attendees, or any thoughts or questions from Chris or Aaron?
And Tiffany, I'll kick it off again. It's striking to me, one, the dissatisfaction of graduates with their counseling experience, especially those with a high debt load. And I know for me personally, I went through the debt counseling for my bachelor's, my master's, and then for my JD. And what it really hit me was when, 6 months post graduation and when any sort of deferment or forbearance was not an option anymore, and the payment amount actually came up. That's really when the rubber hits the road, right? But for those individuals that were having a negative experience with their debt counseling, do you think it's just because the number is just so high that regardless of what level of counseling those students might go through, it's going to be a negative experience? Or do you think there's something more there? And I'm interested in that simply because when we look at the resources and the awareness for those that had yielded higher debt loads, it seemed like they didn't have as much of an advantage or understanding of how to navigate that space. And so any thoughts and recommendations that we might have throughout the higher ed continuum in that space, I think would be welcomed.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation, Aaron, that perhaps, it doesn't matter how well the law school is doing on counseling, the sheer amount of debt, it just kind of puts people in a foul mood, which is understandable, right? But again, I think if the number was 0, I would say absolutely. But there are some across those different debt load categories that did report they were happy with the loan counseling they received. And so as a researcher, I immediately want to say, well, let's talk to these people and understand what was it about their loan counseling experience that made it a good one. But also for those who were not happy with their loan counseling experience, what were their expectations? What more would they have liked to see? And so I think that individual law schools can do their own surveys around this question, right? We surveyed recent law graduates across a number of different institutions, but if this is something that your law school is particularly interested in, then it would be wise, if you're not already, to sort of just have some surveys and have some conversations with your students about whether or not they're getting what they need from their loan counseling, and even talking to alumni about this, because obviously, as you mentioned, Aaron, the realities of the debt don't really hit you until you start repaying your loans. And so it could be that you feel like you're satisfied based on what you know as a student, but then when you graduate and you're in the real world, you're like, wow, I wish I'd known this before. And so I think having those hindsight discussions with alumni could also really be instructive for how loan counseling during law school could be improved.
I just want to jump in for a quick second on a data point that you had shared, Tiffany, about the mental health impacts of student loan as well. Outside of our study here, it's well known throughout the legal profession, throughout studies that the ABA and others have done, that imposter syndrome is a very real phenomenon in the legal profession as well. For those who may not be aware, imposter syndrome is defined as the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. And so I think when you're sharing the statistics on the graphic a couple of slides ago, the majority of respondents saying that they feel anxious or stressed or regretful or guilty, and still a sizable number as well also feel depressed, inadequate, embarrassed. It bears further study as well of how these debt loads, after you are actually out of law school and in practice, how the debt load is further perpetuating that imposter syndrome that exists elsewhere in the law as well.
Absolutely.
I don't think we have any other questions yet, so we're going to move on to reflections that we've heard from our respondents on law school entry and JD attainment. So what we see here is that few respondents who entered law school were clear-eyed and had a clear understanding about law school costs, about the legal job market, and about their academic and career prospects. 2/5 of the respondents here said that they disagreed that they had a clear understanding of the type of work that lawyers do, which could frankly show a fundamental flaw in the awareness and education pool of candidates coming into law school, a failure of law schools to properly educate their candidates on what they're actually getting into as well. Nearly half of the respondents, 48.2%, responded that they disagreed, that they had a clear understanding of how much money lawyers would make. And just over half, 50.8%, responded that they didn't have a clear understanding of the cost and debt associated with law school. We've often seen the bimodal salary distribution that the NALP puts out. And I think often the perception is that people are coming out of law school and attaining jobs in big law, making $180,000 as a starting salary. And if you look at that bimodal salary distribution, that's not the reality of a significant portion of those coming out of law school. And here, I think we can see that many who entered law school did not have that understanding of really what the debt loads were going to be like for them. And then perhaps most troubling on this graphic are those last two rows, which show that they discuss the impact of student loans on personal life and the impact of student loans on career. Nearly 3/5 of those who responded to the survey did not have a clear understanding of the impact that it would have on their career, their personal lives. And pairing these findings, it's possible to say that a sizable portion of respondents had not only a great grasp on the work that they would actually be doing as a lawyer, but on how their lives would be materially affected on a career or personal level by those debt loads, reflecting a critical need for greater education of incoming law students about the realities of law school, of legal practice, and of the debt loads associated with those. Those with the highest debt balances were least likely to agree that they had a clear understanding of those topics. And so here on this next slide, we have a breakdown by the debt load of the respondents as to, first, whether individuals would still get a JD, second, whether they would attend the same law school, and third, whether they believe that their law school education was worth the cost. With each of these data points, as the debt load increases, you can see a decrease in the number of respondents who agree with that statement. And in particular, it's worth pointing out that respondents with more than $100,000 in debt have a pretty marked decrease in the percent who would attend the same law school. You can see that the last two data points in each of these categories, there's a pretty significant decrease as the debt load increases. Additionally, there's a severe drop in the number of respondents responding that their law school education was worth the cost. I'm sorry, you can go to the next slide. So Tiffany, the graphic here relates to, instead of the debt load, similar to the breakdown that you used in a different data point earlier, this is the number of years removed from law school. So we can see that as the number of years increase since the respondent has actually graduated, it decreases whether they would still get a JD, whether they would still attend the same law school, and whether they believe that their law school education was worth the cost. So take with that what you will. I think it's fair to say that the longer that an individual has sat with their debt load based off of this data here, the longer they've actually sat with their debt load, the longer that they've actually dealt with the collateral consequences of that debt load, the more dissatisfied they are with maybe the idea of getting a JD, of attending the same law school, or pursuing the same legal education. Tiffany, anything else to add on that slide?
No, I think what you said is spot on. And this was actually sort of surprising to me and discouraging, because I would expect the reverse. I would expect that the more time you've had to sort of establish yourself as an attorney or in your chosen career after law school, that you've seen sort of the benefits of that, and that those have manifested for you financially and in your ability to achieve certain things for yourself. But as you mentioned, it could be the complete opposite, that as they're sitting with that debt longer and realizing the weight of that decision and how it's impacted them for more years post-graduation than they probably expected, then that's just, they're not as satisfied with their decision to attend. So great.
Yeah, I think, pairing this slide with that earlier slide showing the delay in milestones, you're right. I would assume that, as we saw with greater removal from law school, more years in practice, the higher achievement levels of those milestones, you would assume that there would be greater satisfaction. But again, take with it what you will here. But what we see from this is that nonetheless, the longer that somebody has been removed from law school, the less satisfied they are with the experience that they had as far as cost and going to the law school that they went to. But
yeah, one more thing I want to say before you, Chris, too, because I think it's important to remind all the attendees of this, is that, again, most of the people who responded to our survey did borrow for law school. So it could be that when we survey all law school graduates, we don't see this trend going in the same direction because we have accounted for more people who didn't borrow, or maybe didn't have to borrow the same amount of those who are represented in this sample. And so we don't want the key takeaway to mean that all this is true for all law graduates. It's just for those who were included in the sample, that was their truth, and that's what they reported to us.
Absolutely. And perhaps reassuringly, it's still worth noting that nonetheless, regardless of the breakdowns we've seen here, most of the respondents that we had to the survey would still get a JD knowing what they know now. Although with that, most would also attend a different law school as well. And in attending a different law school, most would have selected a school with a lower tuition or a higher discount. And that's those first two lines of this graphic. Nearly 3/5 would have chosen a school that offered a better scholarship, and 56.5% would have chosen a school with lower tuition. I think it's telling that those two data points have a higher agreement or higher response than those lower down data points on this graphic, which deal more with kind of the non-financial aspects of law school, attending a law school closer to home, or choosing a better market or region. As somebody is thinking about whether to go to law school and where they want to take their legal career, you might think that those factors of proximity to family or proximity to the market might be higher up on the food chain of where somebody might be factoring into their decision making. And really what we saw here was that it's, people in retrospect would have instead focused more on the financials, choosing a school with a better scholarship or a lower tuition. And we'll pause here to see if there's any questions from the audience.
So there's none at the moment, but Chris, I think you brought up a really interesting point with the bimodal curve. And, it dawned upon me as I was looking at the facts and figures here. Do we think there is any correlation? And I know this is, not precisely what we looked at, but do you think there is a correlation to folks perhaps staying in their jobs longer and a larger percentage of folks getting a JD, that there is a sense of market saturation and less opportunity for advancement? So consequently, the ramp up rate at which folks would expect their salaries to increase over time is not as great as it used to be, just because there is so much competition and folks are just staying in their jobs longer. And I think we've seen this cross industries. I'm just wondering, because the dichotomy is so juxtaposed with such a high debt load in getting a professional degree, that it's just much more apparent. And so that's my hypothesis. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at it anecdotally, and then I take it to Tiffany too. I am a government attorney, as you said in my introduction, and so my salary, I'm bound by the government GS schedule for salaries. But I will say we have in the federal government and in governments generally, and this is true outside the government, but I'm talking from a government perspective for a second. We have in the government a real dearth of those who are below age 40, and a serious top heavy workforce of those who are 50, 60, even 70. And so there is certainly an artificial ceiling on advancement within government service. And so I think on some level, just from again, anecdotally from my perspective in the government, you certainly have a struggle to advance on the same trajectory that somebody in my role 20 or 30 years ago may have had with more historical retirement and turnover rates in the government as well. Tiffany, what do you think about that?
No, I think that's a really great perspective to offer, Chris. And I guess the way that I think about it is at a higher level, because I myself, I should share, I'm not a law school graduate, and so I don't really know the legal job market as well as you or Aaron. But one of the things that I'm really curious about, and I know that the National Association for Law Placement provides really great information and really great reports on post-employment outcomes of recent law graduates, but I'm also curious to know the extent to which organizations, professional organizations, or law schools are helping to basically peel back the layers or sort of pull the curtain back on the issue that you just raised, Chris, of what's a reasonable expectation of my career advancement. So I know where I want to go immediately post JD, and I have an idea in my mind potentially of where I want to work in that first year after graduation. But how does that set me up for, advancement, not only in terms of my career, but also my income? How can I expect my career path or trajectory to go? None of us has a crystal ball. The job that I'm doing now, I certainly didn't foresee before I went to graduate school. And so, we have to remain flexible on some level, but I would imagine that for someone entering a law firm, that potentially that progression is a little bit more clear than someone who is going into a public service position or someone who's pursuing some other role. And so I think helping pre-law students as well as current law students understand the realities of various careers and different paths that you could explore, I think is really important for helping them, again, not only understand what to expect as a postgrad, but also when you're assuming this debt load at the beginning of your law school education or making the decision to go to law school, what's a realistic expectation so that you can better assess what's your likely debt to income ratio going to look like post law school.
Yeah, I think, again, I'm not speaking from any data points from our survey. This is more off the cuff and anecdotally, but I think that what I have seen is that a lot of law schools and bar associations and the legal profession in general do a decent job at educating law students and pre-law students about what those first steps outside of law school graduation might look like. You either go work in a public sector job as a public defender or a prosecutor or for government in a different capacity, or you go work as a solo or a law firm attorney. I think, and Aaron, I'd be curious on your take this too, but a lot of people don't know or understand or think that it's possible to go in-house with an organization as well. And so I think there's really a lack of information, a lack of understanding about where you can go with your law degree after, say, that first step, after that 2, 3, 4 years out of law school, when you do start to have a bit more of a footing, but you're not at the level of, say, a senior lawyer yet, as far as experience too. And with that, I think we have a parallel in debt discussions as well. Without the information about where to go after that year 3, year 4, year 5, people don't really consider where they're going to go with their debt and how they're going to manage their debt either, other than, when we're talking about, for example, public service loan forgiveness, people say, well, I need to get 10 years, 120 payments of public service loan forgiveness qualifying payments in order to qualify for this. But that's not really a trajectory either. That's just it's a dual option, right? It's either I stay in this public service loan forgiveness job or I don't, but that's not a trajectory. That's not a plan about what to do in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, Chris. And for myself, I kind of took a non-traditional path. I was in a different sector for a few years after undergrad, worked on my master's while working full-time, and then also came back to Michigan and went to law school part-time in the evening while working full-time. And I think when I graduated and took the bar and then got results, I was still working full-time, right? So I had an opportunity to vet my options maybe a little bit more thoroughly, or at least take a step back and say, here are all the different potentials and trajectories I could go on, and which is going to best fit with my needs and also give me joy and bring me joy in what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I was fortunate to say, the first place I picked, I've been there for 5 years, and I'm one of those 19% on the public service loan forgiveness track of the survey respondents. And so, I have that 120 payment clock too, but I'm also in the same boat of most of the respondents saying that, beyond the 10 years, they intend to stay in that space. But, I very consciously weighed, is it better to go to a mid-sized firm and start at this salary rate and with a potential trajectory here, or, is going in-house and starting, at X payment rate and looking at what the trajectory better for me. And ultimately, I made the choice to go into healthcare, doing contracting and compliance, and kind of taking a more non-traditional pathway and utilizing my JD. But I have great satisfaction. But I think a lot of that was because I took an immense amount of time post-passing the bar to really heavily vet my options. And I know many of my colleagues that I graduated with didn't have that opportunity. So they had to take the first thing that came to them. And unfortunately, they have a different perspective about the value of their JD or how they feel about attaining a JD and how they feel about cutting that payment to the Department of Education each month. And so my recommendation is, if you have the opportunity to be very intentional and weigh out all potential options and really look at that 5, 10, 15-year plan and where that will set you on your trajectory, do it, because it made all the difference in the world in my experience, and it's for the better.
All right, we're 10 minutes remaining. We're going to turn it over to Chris to round us out with a discussion of what the ABA is doing about this and other recommendations that we have.
Thanks, Tiffany. So the Young Lawyers Division has, coming from this study as well as our previous study, recognized that we have some critical, bold steps that we need to take for advocating for student debt relief and reform. And with that in mind, the YLD has drafted and ultimately gotten adopted by the ABA 3 policies over the last year or so. At the August 2020 meeting of the ABA House of Delegates, the Young Lawyers Division brought Resolution 10D. Remember, this is this is August 2020, so this is in the throes of the pandemic and of COVID. We didn't know where the market would be going. We still don't know where the job employment market will be going in many ways. And so the YLD advocated for both administrative forbearance of federally held student loans, and then also calling on governments, bar associations, and lenders to develop and implement programs to assist law students, recent graduates, and young lawyers facing financial hardship with that uncertainty in the market. We know now, more than a year after this was adopted, that ultimately there was forbearance, and ultimately the forbearance, at least as of this time, has been extended through January of 2022. So that has certainly been a success. We also have called for the second resolution here, 106C, was adopted by the American Bar Association House of Delegates in February 2021. And this was kind of an all of the above approach in many ways. It called for measures such as expanding federal repayment to those who had private loans. So if you previously had taken out private loans, allowing you to refinance into federally held public loans, allowing financial federal loans to be refinanced at a later date to more favorable rates, expanding eligibility in the first place for federal loans, and then also for authorizing suspension or forgiveness of student loan obligations. And this was adopted by the ABA as a resounding vote in February 2021. Then the third resolution that we adopted here was just adopted in August of 2021. And this urges Congress to enact legislation to amend the US Bankruptcy Code to permit student loans to be discharged in bankruptcy without needing to prove undue hardship. The key reason being that removing that undue hardship requirement would put the student debt on the same footing as other debt in bankruptcy proceedings. And while this resolution called for abolishing that undue hardship standard, regardless of the amount of time that an individual has been in repayment status, there has been some recent legislative developments as far as legislation being introduced in the Senate calling for removing the undue hardship for those who have been in a period of repayment. I believe it's for 7 years. So there has been some legislative movement in this realm as well. So those are the policies that we have already drafted and adopted, but coming from the perspective of those policy successes and from this survey results, we do have some recommendations and next steps as well. So the first here, going back to that critical slide that Tiffany shared of the mental health impacts that we saw in our respondents, is to expand access to and awareness of free financial and mental health resources for both law graduates and early career attorneys. Despite the financial burden that many young lawyers carry, less than a third reported seeking financial advice from a professional. Only 44% reported knowing how to access that free financial information as well. And so future efforts to provide and promote free financial and mental health is critical, from law schools, from law firms, from bar examiners, from bar associations, to help in this space. The second recommendation here is to continue to lead and sponsor and support initiatives that holistically foster financial wellness and professional development of young lawyers. Ongoing partnerships like those between national bar associations and AccessLex and the Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs are just one avenue to facilitate greater holistic support of recent law grads. Additionally, considering our finding here and in our previous survey that borrowing and student debt efforts are very widely among race and ethnicity, this programming should involve culturally competent experts who are aware of the unique challenges that face the many identities found across the legal profession as well, and within individual lawyers. And partnerships with organizations explicitly dedicated to supporting lawyers from a diversity of backgrounds, such as the Leadership Council on Legal Diversity, would augment and help these efforts as well. The third recommendation here is to improve the public service loan forgiveness program to provide a more transparent and seamless process for those seeking to maintain eligibility. In that first question that we hit early on in the program, we spoke a lot about this, but there is a critical need for greater information about who is eligible for public service loan forgiveness, how you can be eligible for public service loan forgiveness, what loans are actually currently allowed in the program, and then how to actually submit and have a successful application for forgiveness as well, and ultimately discharge those loans. And the fourth recommendation here that we have is to reform federal student aid programs to make repayment options more manageable for borrowers as well. We know, based off of all of the legislative work that's been done in student debt, that the government has to be able to cover its costs to administer programs, but students should not be forced to pay interest rates that greatly exceed the cost of the government as well. And I know I kind of hit at it earlier when I said it's above our pay grade and hopefully in the purview of legislators and lawmakers, but federal policymakers should really reform existing loan and repayment options to work better for struggling borrowers. Things like streamlining the 5 existing income-driven repayment plans into one income-based plan, or lowering interest rates on behalf of all federal student loans. We have a couple more recommendations as well. So here, in line with the resolution I just shared a moment ago about bankruptcy, we should continue as a legal profession to urge policymakers to make it easier for borrowers to discharge their student loans in bankruptcy. This is not a escape route for someone to avoid their obligations. Bankruptcy, even when we're talking about student debt, is a proceeding of last resort, and allowing somebody to discharge the debt that is severely weighing them down and causing them, frankly, to drown in student debt is really, it's not an escape hatch. It's a way to give them that fresh start and allow them to move forward and try and be a productive lawyer, try and be a productive member of society without those burdens hanging them down. We also recommend, again, given the lack of satisfaction that we saw from the study with awareness about what your loans look like, the impacts of your loans, we recommend improving financial literacy and awareness of the legal job market, what options are out there, what, as we talked about, those options look like past the initial step, and how that trajectory in the 3 to 10 year to 15 year to 20 year time frame look like when you're trying to figure out how to pay down your debts as well. And we should also be improving literacy and awareness of the cost of law school attendance among pre-law students as well. We should be improving consumer information available to pre-law students. Although the ABA continues to expand information in disclosures called standard 509 disclosures, there's still some significant gaps in information as well, particularly in the area of law school cost and debt load. Data in the 509 reports and also in US News and World Report only scratch the surface in providing prospective law school applicants information on the realities of using debt to pay for law school. We should be enlightening consumers on the net price, so tuition minus any kind of grants or scholarships of law school attendance, and the types of students most likely to receive aid are among many data points that would help better inform pre-law students as well. And then finally, we have said throughout this program that there's a need for some continued study as well. We believe coming out of this study that we should be surveying YLD members and the greater profession as well about student loan debt. We should be aiming for a higher response rate that's more representative of the YLD membership and of young lawyers generally. We should be seeking clarity on how, if at all, graduates are actually managing student debt and related stress, and probe further on who seeks help and who doesn't, so we can better understand and rectify any kind of gaps in that. We should be considering focus groups and in-depth interviews to better understand these issues and the people and stories behind them, determining whether more seasoned graduates are actually less satisfied as they get further out from graduation, and if so, why? So to Tiffany's question earlier. And then finally, given the conversation we've also had about public service loan forgiveness, we should be seeking to understand the current status that these respondents have towards actually reaching that forgiveness of those of public service loan forgiveness, how far along towards those 120 payments they are. And with that, those are the recommendations. I think we'll pause if there's any questions or turn it over to Aaron for a closing.
Thank you for that, Chris. And I don't believe there are any questions at this time. So I'd like to thank both Tiffany and Chris for being our esteemed panelists today and going over the very important information that we were able to glean from over 1,300 of our ABA YLD members in the 2021 debt report. I would encourage all attendees to take a look at our student debt website, which is ambar.org/debt. On there, you will find the new 2021 debt survey. You'll also find all the events associated with the Student Debt Week of Action. And you'll also find the resolutions that Chris had talked about, as well as articles that have been published, as well as CLE and other webinar and podcasts and other resources that have been focused on this very important topic that impacts so many young lawyers today. So with that, I will leave you all at the top of the hour here. Again, we appreciate you attending this very important conversation. If you have follow-up questions, my information can be found on the ambar.org/debt website. Please feel free to email me directly, and I'm happy to continue the conversation with you. With that, thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful, safe rest of your week.